He lost his wife to cancer and his home to a foreclosure engineered by the powerful. She was a single mother of triplets soaked in rain, clinging to survival. Neither knew the other until one act of kindness in a storm bound them forever. But what began as a moment of shared despair soon unraveled a secret hidden inside a forgotten folder, evidence of a billion-dollar conspiracy designed to crush people like them. What they found would expose the truth behind a financial empire, ignite a nationwide movement, and bring justice most unexpectedly through the courage of a widow, a cleaner, and the woman whose death would change everything. Stay until the end, because this isn't just a story about corruption. It's a story about redemption, revenge, and the quiet power of ordinary people refusing to be erased. The sky above Evermore Heights split open without mercy. Cold November rain poured in sheets drenching the cracked sidewalks and bouncing off the concrete steps of 219 Wexley Street, a place that used to be called home by two families, neither of whom saw this collision coming. Ethan Marshall, 52, stood in disbelief on the front porch, his wool coat clinging to him, like a second skin soaked through and heavy. His fists pounded the locked door as two private security guards flanked him. Their hands, though not cruel, were firm, procedural, unyielding. "This is a mistake." He said more to the universe than to them. His voice, usually composed, cracked, "This is my house." "Not anymore," said the bailiff, a wiry man with a clipboard and a face that had seen too many evictions to care. The foreclosure's final Arkbridge capital took ownership as of 9:00 a.m. this morning. Ethan blinked hard, rain streaking down his face, mingling with something warmer, grief, confusion, disbelief. He wanted to scream, not out of anger, but from the kind of silent despair that makes a man question whether the world has simply decided to break him one piece at a time. It had already taken his wife Julia just 3 months earlier. And now it wanted her memory. "Sir, you have 1 hour to gather your belongings," the bailiff said flatly. "Then the premises will be sealed." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't, because just then a cry pierced the gray air. Not his own. A woman younger, maybe mid-30s, disheveled and soaked, was kneeling on the pavement near the side gate. Her arms were wrapped tightly around 3 tiny children huddled under a worn-out fleece blanket that looked like it belonged in a donation bin. "My kids, please," she choked. "They're only 4. They can't sleep in the cold." The triplets, a girl and 2 boys, clung to her legs like they'd been taught to fear the world early. One had mismatched boots. Another's teeth chattered audibly. Ethan stared at them, his breath catching. He hadn't noticed her before. Not really. She must have lived in the garden unit. The basement apartment, Julia had always said, felt too isolated. "Who's she?" Ethan asked the bailiff. The man shrugged. Rachel Moore rented the back unit, but the foreclosure's for the entire structure. Rachel's eyes met his wide and pleading. She didn't beg with words now. Just that look, the silent, exhausted plea of someone who had run out of dignity before she ran out of strength. Ethan felt something stir in him. Something primal, protective. A feeling he thought he'd buried with Julia. He looked back at his house, at the windows that still held her curtains, in the garden she'd planted beneath the porch, at the place that had once smelled of basil and cinnamon and Sunday mornings, and then back at the children, small trembling bodies pressed against a woman who had endured too much alone. For a moment, everything paused. The rain, the eviction, the pain in his chest. Time bent inward. "Where will you go?" he asked Rachel softly. She hesitated. "I don't know." And Ethan did something then that surprised even himself. "Come with me," he said. She blinked. "What?" "My cousin has a cabin out by Lake Marion. It's not much, but it has a fireplace, blankets, hot food. Better than this." The bailiff raised an eyebrow. One of the guards looked sideways, but no one stopped him. Rachel's lips trembled. "Why would you—" "Because no one stopped the world from taking everything from me," Ethan said quietly. "But maybe I can stop it from taking something from you." And with that, 2 people, strangers, bound by circumstance and soaked in shared sorrow, turned away from the cold, boarded an old Ford wagon, and began driving towards something neither of them could yet name. Behind them, the house stood hollow. But ahead of them, in a cabin none of them had seen, slept not just shelter, but a secret waiting to be uncovered. A secret that would crack the very walls of Arkbridge Capital and the men who sat comfortably behind them. The rain had softened into a mist by the time they reached the cabin. It stood like a forgotten memory, beside the silent edge of Lake Marion, an old structure with sagging shingles, cracked window panes, and the scent of damp pine wrapped in years of dust. but inside it was warm. The fire Ethan built crackled with effort. A kettle whistled on the stove. The triplets lay on a patchwork couch under blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. Their tiny bodies curled into one another like puppies finally asleep. Rachel sat on the floor beside them, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, steam coiling up toward her face. She hadn't said much since they arrived, neither had Ethan. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet laced with exhaustion and something else. Unasked questions, things they both noticed but didn't name yet. Ethan stood in the kitchen, stirring powdered cocoa into hot water, watching her. She didn't seem like someone who'd just been evicted. There was a calmness in the way she folded the blankets, a precision in how she inspected the firewood rack and refilled it without being asked. And then there was that moment earlier in the house when her eyes lingered on Julia's photo. He'd seen that look before. Not curiosity, recognition. He took a breath, let it out. This wasn't the time. He handed her the mug and nodded toward the corner. There's an extra bed in the loft. You should rest soon. Rachel glanced upward. Not tonight, I'm not sure I'd sleep. Ethan nodded. Me neither. She looked at the fire for a long time, before whispering, I'm sorry. We barely know each other, and I've dragged you into my mess. You didn't drag me anywhere, Ethan said, sitting down across from her. The real criminals are sitting in boardrooms right now, probably toasting the neighborhoods they just gutted. A beat of silence passed. Then she shifted. Her canvas bag tipped slightly and a manila folder slipped out onto the rug. It wasn't thick, a dozen papers, maybe random. But Ethan's eyes locked on something. The logo, black angular and distinct Arkbridge Capital Holdings, stamped across the corner of a page titled Internal Memorandum. Operation Iron Sweep. He reached down slowly. What's this? He asked, careful not to sound accusatory. Rachel's eyes widened. Oh, it's just papers? I clean their offices. Sometimes I take home sheets that are blank on one side, so the kids can draw. Ethan flipped through the folder. Most were unremarkable at first glance until one page caught his breath. Targeted foreclosure, risk mapping. Minority and low-income zones. Color-coded overlays. Red lines slicing across zip codes he knew too well. One of them was his neighborhood. He looked up, heart beginning to pound. Rachel, do you realize what this is? Her voice shook. Not really, I didn't even read most of it. This is a map, a plan. He ran a hand through his hair. They have been engineering foreclosures, choosing which neighborhoods to clean up based on demographics. She frowned confused. Why would they do that? To make room for high-end development investors, real estate trusts. The same way they came for me, for you. Ethan stood clutching the folder, suddenly breathless. And Julia, he whispered. Rachel looked up. Your wife. She worked for a consulting firm, financial analysis. Just before she got sick, she told me something felt off about the clients she was assigned. She saw patterns in their investments, something she couldn't explain. But she died before she ever told me what she'd found. He stared down at the pages. You've been sitting on the very proof she may have died for. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. Ethan, are you saying... I'm saying this isn't a coincidence. He turned toward the fireplace, the folder now trembling in his hands. This wasn't just about a lost home. This was about Julia, and someone had made sure she'd never finish the story. Morning came, gray and reluctant. The sky over Lake Michigan held its breath. Inside the cabin, a new kind of tension replaced the cold. Not fear, not exactly. But something sharper, the sensation of a lid about to lift from a boiling pot. Ethan hadn't slept. He'd spent most of the night cross-legged on the rug, the folder spread around him like the ruins of a civilization. His reading glasses perched on his nose, dark crescents under his eyes, a growing storm in his chest. Rachel awoke to the sound of pages flipping and pencil scribbles on notepaper. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the children who were still wrapped in blanket cocoons. You haven't stopped, have you? She asked softly. I couldn't, he replied, eyes still scanning the pages. Rachel, you have no idea what you stumbled on. She walked over, rubbed her arms against the morning chill. Then tell me. He looked up, voice steady, but charged. This isn't just predatory lending, it's engineered. These memos describe an algorithm Arkbridge developed. It flags homeowners by zip code, race data, number of children, and even marital status. They call it a risk index, but it's not the risk they're measuring, it's expendability. Rachel sank into a chair, stunned. They've labeled entire communities as disposable, he continued. Minorities, single mothers, widowers, immigrants. Anyone whose voice they thought too soft to fight back. A silence fell between them. And then Ethan whispered something that made her chest tighten. Julia was looking into something like this. Rachel turned. What do you mean? She was consulting for a hedge fund, not Arkbridge directly, but a shell client that tied back to them through ownership layers. She said she kept seeing demographic patterns tied to asset seizure and rapid redevelopment. She even showed me a chart once. All the neighborhoods are circled in red. Red, Rachel echoed, like the maps in that file. He nodded slowly. She asked too many questions. She always did. I remember telling her to stop, that sometimes people get hurt for digging too deep. His voice cracked on that last word. Rachel placed a hand on his arm, tentative. You think they? I don't know what to think anymore. Ethan exhaled, holding back tears. But I know she was denied treatment 3 times by her insurer. We thought it was just bureaucracy. But this, he held up a memo titled Cost Containment Strategy Flagged Clients for Delayed Approval. Her name's not on it, but the policy fits too perfectly. The fire crackled beside them. Rachel sat back, absorbing the weight of it all. Then what do we do? Ethan stood and reached for his phone. We get help. Later that day, Naomi Kent arrived at the cabin. A woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, coffee-colored skin, and a presence like a courtroom gavel. She stepped inside, instantly sensing the undercurrent in the room. Ethan introduced her quickly. She was Julia's attorney when the hospital denied her clinical trial access. Naomi took off her coat and sat at the table. All right, she said, spreading out the papers. Show me what you got. Over the next 2 hours, the cabin transformed into a war room. Ethan explained every document, every red flag, every ghost line Julia once followed. Naomi's expression shifted from skepticism to astonishment. Then fury. This isn't foreclosure, she muttered. It's financial cleansing. Rachel clutched her mug. We've both lost our homes. Ethan lost his wife, and the people responsible are untouchable. Naomi's eyes narrowed. No one's untouchable. Not if you have the right match to light the fire. She tapped the edge of the folder. This is evidence, but if we want to burn the house down, we'll need more. Ethan leaned forward. I think Julia left more. Naomi raised a brow where he looked toward Rachel. She had a safe A-black flash drive. I never found it after she passed. But maybe Rachel has it without knowing. Rachel stared at him. You mean something hidden in those papers? Ethan nodded. It may be the piece that brings all of this together. Outside, the lake was still. Inside, the first pieces of a revolution were falling into place, not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, but in a forgotten cabin where grief had turned into clarity. And clarity was becoming a weapon. Night fell in a hush. Outside, frost clung to the windows of the cabin like a warning. Inside, the air was warm, but no one spoke much. Naomi had gone back to the city to prepare legal groundwork, promising to return at dawn. The triplets were asleep again, curled together on a cot. Innocent faces, untouched by the storm their mother had just walked into. Ethan stood by the fire, the orange glow reflecting off his glasses. He hadn't moved much since Naomi left. Rachel sat nearby, nervously thumbing through the manila folder, her fingertips smudged with graphite from Ethan's notes. Then it happened. A soft click, a false bottom in the folder, slipped open. Rachel froze. Nestled between 2 sheets of standard policy printouts was something she hadn't noticed before, a sleek matte black flash drive, unmarked except for 3 tiny initials scratched into the edge in delicate cursive. EJM. Ethan's breath caught. He crossed the room slow and deliberate, as if approaching a sacred object. When he saw the initials, his voice dropped to a whisper. Julia Elizabeth Marshall. Rachel looked up. You think this was hers? I know it was... He took it with trembling hands and walked to the old laptop Naomi had left on the table. It buzzed to life, the fan groaning with age. He plugged in the drive. The screen flickered. A folder appeared. Operation Justice. Inside were dozens of subfolders, names, dates, maps, email, threads. But one file stood out. If you're watching this MP4, he clicked. The screen faded to black, then lit with the warm glow of a recorded video. And there she was, Julia, wearing her gray cardigan, sitting in their old home office. Her eyes are calm, steady. If you're watching this, her voice said, it means I didn't survive to tell the story. But that doesn't mean the story dies with me. Ethan leaned forward, frozen. I was hired to analyze portfolio behavior for a shell company under Arkbridge Holdings. But what I found was something far more sinister. The screen cut to clips she had spliced together, spreadsheets marking minority neighborhoods, with a red overlay memos discussing undesirable tenant blocks, internal jokes in email threads about urban cleanup and demographic purification. Rachel gasped. Julia's voice returned. They call it Operation Iron Sweep. It's not a mistake, it's a design, an economic algorithm that flags minority-owned mortgages, tracks their payment behavior, and manipulates denial cycles through their in-house insurance partner. My insurance provider, the one that delayed my treatment until it was too late. Ethan couldn't breathe. Rachel's hands covered her mouth. My God. The screen shifted to a series of emails. One thread read, "From Gregory Lorne, subject re-analyst, red flag. That Mexican analyst is digging too deep. If she keeps going, she'll find the bones we buried. Maybe it's time to show her what happens to people who forget their place." Another reply. "We'll go the medical route, deny access delay options. Let nature do the rest. It worked before." Rachel stood abruptly, stumbling back. "They killed her." Ethan whispered, "No. They murdered her." The fire crackled. The triplets stirred. But in that cabin, a storm had already begun. Not of rain or thunder, but of righteous fury coiled in silence. Ethan rose slowly, his eyes locked on Julia's frozen image. "They thought this would die with her," he said, "but she made sure the truth would find a way." He turned to Rachel. "We have everything we need." Rachel's voice trembled. "Then what do we do now?" Ethan looked toward the window, where snow had begun to fall. "We finish what she started." The next morning arrived draped in snow. Lake Marion was still a frozen mirror beneath pale light. But inside the cabin, the silence had changed. It was no longer the hush of uncertainty. It was the focus before a strike. Naomi Kent returned just after dawn, brushing flakes from her coat, her boots soaked from the forest path. She didn't even take off her gloves before asking, "Did you find anything?" Ethan handed her the flash drive. His eyes said everything. Within an hour, the cabin once again transformed into a command center. Papers covered the dining table, laptops hummed, the fire hissed softly in the hearth, and amid it all, 3 ordinary people were laying the groundwork for the fall of a giant. Naomi scrolled through the files, her face taut with rage and awe. This is a bombshell, fraud-targeted discrimination and deliberate medical interference, and these recordings. Names, voice prints, locations, dates. Ethan added, "Julia built this, like she knew she wouldn't survive it." "She didn't just collect evidence," Naomi murmured. "She built a case the world couldn't ignore, even from the grave." Rachel sat beside them, silent but listening, arms wrapped around herself, as if to contain the storm in her chest. Naomi looked at both of them. "We can go to the FBI now, take this to the courts." Ethan shook his head. "No, not yet." Naomi blinked. "What?" "I don't want this buried in bureaucracy, not sealed in evidence bags for months, while people like Gregory Lorne spin the narrative. They'll say it's fake, claim their victims, and walk away richer. Then what do you propose? We hit them publicly, loudly, in front of every camera they control." Rachel's eyes widened at the press conference. Ethan nodded. Arkbridge was days away from unveiling its Urban Renaissance Initiative, a program ironically built on the back of Operation Iron Sweep. They planned to celebrate their success in eradicating financial inefficiency across the city. Gregory Lorne would speak, the mayor would attend. What better place, Ethan said, to let Julia speak for herself? Naomi leaned back, considering, "You'd need someone inside the broadcast system." "I know a guy," she said, after a beat. "From my days as a consumer protection litigator. He owes me a favor. He works tech for WBN. Then we embed the video." Ethan said, timed live. Rachel hesitated. "But won't they see it coming? Not if it's hidden inside their system. Not if it looks like one of their promotional reels until it doesn't." Naomi smirked. "You're asking for a corporate ambush." "No," Ethan corrected her gently. "We're asking for justice. In their language, in their house, on their stage." Rachel looked down at her trembling hands. "Do you think this will work?" Ethan turned to her. His voice was quiet, but full of something deeper than certainty. A kind of grief-forged faith. "I think Julia died trying to tell this story, but she left the ending for us to write." Rachel nodded, and in that snowy cabin among coffee-stained papers and legal jargon, they lit a flame the world would soon see. Not out of vengeance, but the truth, the kind that doesn't knock politely, the the kind that burns. The ballroom of the Marston Grand Hotel glittered like a celebration of everything wrong with the world. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, casting golden light onto polished marble floors. Champagne flowed into fluted glasses. Camera crews set up in neat rows along the back, adjusting tripods and sound levels. The banner behind the podium read, "Arkbridge Capital presents the Urban Renaissance Initiative." To most of the crowd, executives, city officials, developers, it was just another launch. Another scripted victory lap, where numbers would be massaged, injustices renamed progress, and those responsible for suffering would be praised for innovation. But hidden behind the set of display screens mounted behind the stage, something waited. At exactly 10:03 a.m. it would wake. Backstage, Gregory Lorne, CEO of Arkbridge Capital, adjusted his navy tie and smirked at his reflection. The cameras adored him. The city owed him. Today he would unveil a billion-dollar expansion and crown himself the savior of urban renewal. He had no idea. At that same moment, in a small studio van parked across the street, Naomi Kent stood over a technician's shoulder. "You're sure it's cued?" she asked. The technician, sweaty but focused, nodded. "Video will auto-trigger at 10:03. We embedded it into their branded highlight reel. Their system won't stop it unless they pull power." Naomi turned to Rachel, seated quietly in the corner, dressed not as a cleaner, but in a sharp blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back neatly. "You still sure you want to do this?" Naomi asked. Rachel didn't blink. "They called people like me trash. Let's take out the garbage." "This isn't the Gregory Lorne stepped onto the stage to applause. He waved, posed briefly for cameras, then settled behind the podium like a man about to bless the masses with his genius. "Thank you for joining us on this historic day." He began smoothly. "Today, Arkbridge is proud to unveil a new chapter in the revitalization of our city." He clicked a remote. The screens behind him came to life, corporate footage, shining drone shots of neighborhoods, graphs, smiling families. "Through responsible financial engineering, we have restored dignity to forgotten districts." Day at 3 a.m. The footage glitched. A brief flicker, a moment of static. Then, Julia. Her face, her voice. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't survive to tell the story. But that doesn't mean the truth won't find a way." The room fell silent. Cameras whirred, confused. Lorne turned, blinking. Julia's voice continued. Calm, precise. "For over a year, I worked as a data consultant for a firm tied to Arkbridge Holdings. What I discovered was horrifying, deliberate targeting of minority homeowners and single mothers. A strategy masked as revitalization, called Operation Iron Sweep. The footage rolled through spreadsheets, color-coded maps, internal memos with racial and income filters. Then came the emails. Let's start with zips, over 80% Black or Latino. Delay approvals, push foreclosures, flip the properties before they can sue." Gregory Lorne's smile was gone. He stepped toward the technician booth, whispering, "Cut the feed. Now." But no one moved. Behind the screens, a technician met Naomi's eyes through the glass and gave the smallest nod. The video continued. Audio recordings filled the hall. Executives laughed. "That Mexican analyst is poking around again. Let the cancer take care of her. If she dies, she dies. It's just business." A collective gasp swept through the audience. Lorne stumbled back from the podium. "This is doctored," he shouted. It's fake." But the next clip played. A phone call. Lorne's voice. "Deny the trial. I don't care if it's experimental. Let the system wear her down." Another voice replied, "You mean Julia Marshall." Silence. Then Lorne again. "Exactly." The room turned cold. At 10:15 a.m., a side door opened. FBI agents entered, flanking both sides of the hall. Cameras swung toward them like predators to prey. Gregory Lorne. One agent announced, "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, financial discrimination, corporate manslaughter, and obstruction of justice." Flashes burst as photographers erupted. Rachel stepped onto the stage, holding Julia's flash drive like a torch. Ethan followed silent, steady the storm that had been waiting for this moment since Julia's final breath. Lorne was handcuffed, his voice a pathetic echo. "You don't understand? It was just business." Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but thunderous in its restraint. "Julia was my wife. She was 42. She taught math to underserved kids. She planted tomatoes. She wasn't a statistic, and you let her die." Lorne looked down, sweat dripping from his jaw. No more words. Ethan continued. You called us undesirable, but it was people like us who brought you down. A widow, a cleaner, and a woman you thought was trash. The hall erupted. Some reporters wept. Others clapped. The screens behind them now showed not data, but faces rows upon rows of families displaced by Arkbridge victims of iron sweep. But now survivors, and this was only the beginning. The old Arkbridge Capitol Tower didn't look like a place of power anymore. Gone were the marble plaques, the armored reception desk, the portraits of grinning executives who once controlled neighborhoods with the flick of a pen. Now the lobby smelled of lavender and soap, not wealth and fear. Where corporate slogans once glowed in LED, there were now crayon murals, community bulletin boards, and the soft echo of children's laughter. The building had a new name, the Julia Marshall Justice Center, and this was no hollow rebrand. It was reclamation. Ethan stood near the window of the 27th floor, formerly Gregory Lorne's executive office, and watched the city sprawl beneath him. The same streets that Arkbridge once colored red with eviction markers now pulsed with something different. Life voices resistance. Below, families gathered in the courtyard for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Children ran past folding chairs, while volunteers handed out hot cocoa food trucks lined the sidewalk. And in front of a mural of Julia, surrounded by painted butterflies, stood Rachel Moore, not as a guest, not as a symbol of pity, but as the community programs director. She was wearing the same navy blazer she had worn to the press conference, but now it fit differently. Not in size, but in purpose. Confidence replaced hesitation, fire replaced apology. "Are you ready?" she asked, stepping into Ethan's office. He turned more than I thought I'd ever be. She handed him a folder of registration forms. "We've already enrolled 120 families in housing restoration, legal aids booked through next month, and the literacy program for kids. Tripled since Tuesday." Ethan smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. "It's happening?" Rachel nodded. "Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it builds." They walked down the hallway together, past walls painted by local artists, through meeting rooms now used for free financial counseling, past classrooms where former Arkbridge employees, now cooperating with prosecutors, taught business ethics under court order. At the far end, they stopped in front of a polished silver plaque, the Lena Wing, in memory of Julia Marshall. Below it, a quote, "Justice is not revenge. Justice is rebuilding what cruelty tried to erase." Rachel touched the wall gently, her fingers lingering. "She never got to see this. She made this," Ethan replied. "Every file she saved, every risk she took, every minute she spent trying to protect people like us. She built the foundation before we ever laid the bricks." Just then, the triplets Clara, Theo, and Mia barreled down the hall, laughing, their winter boots squeaking on the tiles. They waved at Rachel as they darted toward the mural room for art class. Rachel watched them go, her chest swelling with something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Safety. Hope. Funny. She said, "A year ago, I was mopping this very floor. And now," Ethan said with a grin, "you're changing the lives of everyone who walks across it." They stood there a moment longer, two people who had once been strangers in the rain, now architects of a future that never would have existed if not for Julia's courage and a forgotten flash drive in a cleaning bag. Outside, snow began to fall again, not heavy but gently, as if the sky was giving the city a second chance. The van arrived just after lunch. It wasn't discreet not by design, but by consequence. The federal corrections vehicle pulled up in front of the Julia Marshall Justice Center with a mechanical wheeze and the dull clank of steel doors. The logo of the Department of Corrections was emblazoned on its side, a grim reminder that not every kind of justice wears a suit. Inside sat a man who once considered himself untouchable. Gregory Lorne, former CEO of Arkbridge Capital, stepped out in a faded orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him. He looked smaller now, not physically, but spiritually. The weight of disgrace had shrunk him. The confident smirk that once ruled press conferences had long vanished, replaced by a hollow sort of stillness. He squinted at the building, the same skyscraper he once stood atop, watching the city bow. Now his name was carved off the stone outside, and in its place stood hers, Julia Marshall. A federal officer handed him over to the volunteer coordinator at the front desk. "He's court-assigned," the officer explained. "Community service 2 days a week, 25-year sentence." The young volunteer nodded. "Right this way." Gregory's boots echoed against the freshly polished floor as he followed them down the corridor, past classrooms, past therapy spaces, past the very walls where his company's secret maps once hung. He paused briefly when they passed a brightly painted mural. A girl in a yellow sundress, Julia smiling, surrounded by butterflies. He swallowed. Waiting for him in the kitchen was Donna Maria, 68 years old, short and formidable. She had lost her home 2 years prior. It was Gregory's policy that had flagged her mortgage as a non-viable investment. She handed him an apron without ceremony. "You serve with respect," she said. "Look people in the eye, smile, ask if they want more." He nodded quietly. The kitchen was hot and crowded. Trays of food lined the counters. Volunteers bustled around him. Students, retirees, young parents. Everyone had a purpose. Lauren's hands, once manicured and used to signing seven-figure deals, now trembled as he ladled soup into paper bowls. The first hour passed in silence. Then an elderly black woman stopped in front of him in the serving line. Her eyes scanned his face with laser precision. "You," she said softly. "You took my house." Gregory froze. "I had 3 grandchildren. We slept in a shelter for 4 months." He looked down. "I'm sorry." The woman stared at him for a moment longer, then nodded. Feeling sorry doesn't fix the past, but serving might change the future. And she moved on. For the first time in years, Gregory didn't feel powerful, or clever, or rich. He felt human, small, and maybe finally teachable. Later that afternoon, Ethan found him in the dish room scrubbing trays. "Kitchen duty suits you," Ethan said. Gregory turned eyes rimmed red from heat and humiliation. "You think this changes anything?" he asked, voice hoarse. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "No, but Julia did. And this center, these people, they're what change looks like. You're just getting a glimpse." Gregory nodded silent. Ethan walked away but left him with one last line. Justice isn't just prison time. It's accountability. And maybe a little redemption if you're lucky. 3 weeks after Gregory Lorne served his first meal in the kitchen, the Julia Marshall Justice Center received a letter. It came not from a neighbor or a local beneficiary, but from the Department of Justice itself. A formal request, summons, an opportunity. They had reviewed the Arkbridge files, all of them. The flash drive, the memos, the demographic heat maps, the recorded meetings. Julia's digital legacy had been forwarded to multiple federal task forces. What they uncovered went far beyond Arkbridge Capital. Arkbridge, it turned out, had not been a rogue actor. It was a blueprint. Other firms were running similar programs under different names. Urban value, alignment, legacy, transition, initiatives, sustainable tenant strategy. Harmless titles, masking the same cruel core targeting marginalized communities, bleeding them dry, and flipping the land. The government needed someone to lead the task force. Someone who understood the victims, not just the systems. They wanted Rachel Moore and Ethan Marshall. At first, Rachel laughed when she read it aloud in the office Ethan now used, still covered in hand-drawn thank you notes from neighborhood children. From cleaning bathrooms to briefing the Senate, she said, shaking her head. Ethan smiled, a kind that rose more from pride than surprise. "Julia would have seen it coming," he replied. "Would have written the speech for us," Rachel added. "She already did," Ethan said, tapping the flash drive that now sat in a velvet-lined case in the center's entrance hall under glass. "We just have to deliver it." Within a month, Rachel and Ethan were flying to Washington. Not as symbols, not as charity cases, but as leaders. They stood before the Senate Oversight Committee on Financial Accountability, flanked by Naomi Kent and several other attorneys who had taken up the cause. Julia's name was no longer a whisper between grieving friends. It was now part of proposed legislation. The Marshall Act, a sweeping anti-discrimination financial reform bill, is designed to ban algorithmic targeting by race, gender, or family status. Audit all foreclosures within a 5-year window. Mandate transparency in private mortgage algorithms. Criminalize knowingly discriminatory financial policies. Rachel took the podium. Her voice didn't tremble. Every page Julia saved was meant to save someone else, and it did. It saved me, my children, Ethan, thousands more. She gave her life to show that what corporations called data was pain, real human lives measured and discarded. A senator asked if she believed the bill went far enough. Rachel looked him straight in the eye. "It's a start. But real justice happens when little girls like my Clara grow up never having to fight for their home." That night, as they returned to the Julia Center, the triplets met them at the door, clutching cardboard signs made in the art room. One read, "My mom is a hero." The other, "We won." And on the kitchen counter, sat a bouquet of daisies with a single card unsigned. It read, "She believed truth was like water. She was right. Now you're the river." 1 year later, spring came early to the city that once drowned in winter evictions and corporate decay. At the corner of 7th and Fairmont, where Arkbridge once plotted how to clear out undesirables, tulips now bloomed in vibrant defiance, murals stretched across brick walls painted by children and artists, survivors and dreamers. In the very plaza where Gregory Lorne once announced the expansion of his empire, a sculpture now stood tall, a bronze figure of a woman kneeling with a laptop in her lap, eyes lifted toward the sky, surrounded by butterflies carved into the stone. The plaque read, "Julia Marshall, 1981-2023, analyst, wife, whistleblower, architect of truth. Justice is like water. It always finds a way." Inside the Justice Center, Ethan Marshall stood in what used to be Arkbridge's war room, now converted into a community strategy lab. Behind him were shelves filled with case files, housing petitions, school reports, and photographs of reclaimed families. A knock came at the glass door. Rachel stepped in. She wore no makeup, no pretense, just a purpose and a soft smile. "You ready?" she asked. Ethan nodded always. Together, they made their way to the new Lena wing, named for Julia. Children's voices rang through the halls, laughter music, the soft thud of art supplies hitting tabletops. It didn't sound like justice, it sounded like freedom. In the center's largest hall, nearly 500 people had gathered. Advocates, families, lawmakers, educators. The first annual Julia Marshall Forum for Economic Equity had drawn attention across the country. Rachel stood at the podium as camera crews adjusted their lenses. The same woman who once begged for shelter in the rain now commanded the attention of a nation. She looked out at the crowd. "I used to believe justice came from people in power. From buildings like this," she began, "but I was wrong. Justice starts in places no one notices, in kitchens, in broken homes, in soaked blankets under bridges, and it blooms when someone like Julia refuses to stay silent." She paused, "And it grows when the rest of us choose to speak up too." Meanwhile, in a community garden 2 blocks away, Gregory Lorne knelt in the soil beside Donna Maria. It was his 2nd year of court-mandated service, his orange uniform now replaced by a pale blue apron. He didn't speak much, but he listened, he learned. He no longer looked like a man trying to salvage status. He looked like a man trying to grow something. An elderly woman approached, placed a daisy in his hand. "No one forgets," she said, "but some of us forgive." That evening, as the center closed, Ethan and Rachel walked slowly through the rooftop garden Julia once dreamed of planting. "She'd be proud," Rachel said. Ethan looked up at the stars. "She is proud." They stood beside a bench beneath a metal sculpture of butterflies. From below, the laughter of the triplets echoed upward. Theo was pretending to be a lawyer. Clara had drawn a picture of the community center. Mia held a cardboard sign that said, "My mom changed the world." Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Julia's flash drive, now sealed, retired. Not because it no longer mattered, but because its work was done. He handed it to Rachel. "For safekeeping," he said. She nodded, her eyes glistening. And together they sat beneath a night filled with stars, no longer mourning the past, but guarding the legacy that had risen from it. Because in the end, Arkbridge didn't fall from force. It collapsed under the quiet weight of ordinary people who refused to stay invisible. People like Julia, like Rachel, like Ethan. And as history would come to record, sometimes the most powerful revolutions are born in silence and carried forward by love. In the end, it wasn't a courtroom that brought justice. It was a flash drive hidden in a cleaning bag, a widower's grief sharpened into purpose, and the voice of a woman who refused to stay silent even in death. What Ethan, Rachel, and Julia proved is something experts in systemic injustice have long said, but the world too often ignores corruption, doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a suit, signs a lease, and smiles for the cameras. But the antidote to power isn't power. It's true. Truth uncovered by ordinary people who refuse to look away, who pick up the pieces, dig through the documents, and say, "Not this time." This wasn't just about Arkbridge Capital. It was about the kind of society we choose to be, and the future they built a justice center where kids laugh and displaced families heal is the kind of legacy that reminds us. Real justice doesn't just punish, it rebuilds.